cool.
All right, Quinn speaking first, OG. Yasmin speaking second, OG.
Hajara speaking.
Sullivan speaking first, OO.
Nate speaking second.
Hajara speaking first, CG.
Cynthia speaking second.
Justin speaking first, CEO.
And Amanda speaking second. All right. Honorable panel, books provide us the opportunity to engage with new ideas. They challenge our understanding. They're a form of transport. They are incredibly therapeutic. Books provide us the opportunity to engage with new worlds, and because of this, this house, as libraries in the United States, would never ban books from our shelves. Okay, so first thing, we're gonna defend this motion, first off talking about why books are good, second, talking about why banning books are bad, and third, talking about whether, even if you think banning books can be beneficial in some cases, why society is now overall better if specific books are banned. So first, why books are good. First off, books provide knowledge. In many ways, books are the first ways we engage with new ideas, whether or not it is reading a biology textbook, for instance, in class, or reading about like Harry Potter and Harry Potter's experience in Hogwarts. Like, we think that where am I even going with this? Fuck that. Anyways, so books provide knowledge because they allow us to engage with new ideas, new thought processes, whether it's like an informational textbook or reading about someone's like childhood experience, reading a memoir, reading a biography. And we think that because books provide knowledge and because books are educational instruments that allow us to grow, books are incredibly good. But the thing and so when institutions or schools and libraries ban books that limits students' access to new ideas, this is in contradiction to learning and in contradiction to why books are so good. We think that when you ban books, you limit people's learning. We also think that books are good because they teach us to empathize. Reading books allows us to engage with new experience that maybe you haven't experienced before. I'm going to bring back that Harry Potter example where, Dumbledore dies, and it is, incredibly sad, and you feel that emotion, and you feel that empathy, and you really don't even, maybe you've never experienced someone, important in your life dying, but, in that moment, you are tied to these characters. You feel Harry's pain, you feel that emotion, and maybe in real life, this allows you to empathize with others who do experience death in their lives. Maybe, the ability to empathize through characters within a novel allows you to engage better with interactions within your daily lives. Maybe reading a book about a girl whose best friend had cancer allows you to better be there for a friend whose father or mother or relation is is going through chemotherapy, for example. We think that books allow you to engage with different situations that apply to real life. We think that the hardships that you encounter when you read books and the pain that makes books so fascinating and interesting that you internalize and make you feel as your own help you and facilitate your daily interactions. And Amanda.
Okay, thank you. So we doubt that libraries would ban books about people going through chemotherapy or feeling emotional pain. We think they would ban books that spread hateful messages that we don't want in our society.
Well, we think that's wrong. We think that in the status quo, a lot of books are banned due to trigger warnings. There are a lot of books that describe the in-depth accounts of rape victims that are banned because they're triggers for other people. But we think that analyzing someone's memoir on their rape experience or analyzing someone's memoir on how they experience sexual assault or harassment in the workplace is incredibly beneficial for understanding people's pain, understanding those situations, and maybe being there in real life when your friend has experienced something along the lines of sexual assault or harassment. We think that this prepares you for the real world where terrible things do happen, and a lot of books aren't banned just because they have hateful things or they're Mein Kampf. We think that a lot of books are banned because, for ridiculous reasons. Harry Potter was banned for witchcraft and wizardry, which was against which was against specific religions. For example, Huckleberry Finn was banned because they had, the N-word in there. And we think that, yes, that's, that it can be triggering for some people, but we also think that, engaging with these ideas is incredibly beneficial for not only understanding the historical context of situations, but for being able to like see also how far we come and how far we progressed. Okay, second, why banning books is bad. First off, we think that it's just bad because it limits the free speech of authors who can no longer share their idea if their books are banned within specific places. We think that books are an extension of free speech, just as you can like publish anything on the internet or in the news or say anything. We think that like books you can publish anything, and therefore they should have and banning them in libraries really does prevent the circulation of those books. The second thing why banning books is bad is that it limits our knowledge and our understanding of others in the context of specific issues. Even if you ban books such as like Mein Kampf, which is like really like terrible, and it was like the beginnings of like Nazism and like World War II, we think that like having books on those shelves so that people can access and understand the context of issues, the reasoning behind Hitler before he was Hitler, the reasoning behind the entire World War II movement, understanding the nuances and the complexities of issues through reading books that inspire people to do bad things is really essential for not only combating those bad things from repeating, but for gaining a more nuanced perspective and a better understanding of historical contexts and terrible things that happened in the past. We think that, and third off, like why banning books is bad is that like, yes, these books are present on your shelves, but if they're incredibly harmful, you do not have to read them. We're not slamming books in your face and go like, look, read this like terrible, detrimental like thing that is going to make you feel really terrible about yourself, or like that is really harmful to your past because of like a specific historical context. We think that like books should just be able to have presence on these shelves so that people can read them if they want to. We think that if libraries decide to ban specific books, this isn't going to prevent these ideas from circulating. We think that people will just buy them on the internet or Amazon Prime it or find a PDF online. We think that this like won't actually stop these books from being in circulation, and it won't actually stop these ideas from pervading, and won't actually stop people from being harmfully affected by them. And so the third thing that I like to talk about is even if you think banning books can be beneficial in specific cases because of like specific triggers, or because they can be specifically harmful, or because their content is hard to comprehend or is harmful, we think that like the benefits on our side of like not ever banning books prevents this like slippery slope fallacy from like, you know, banning specific books and then banning more books because, you know, like, oh, say we're gonna like ban all books that have like the term N-word in it, and then we're gonna ban all books that have any sort of like slavery in it. We think that this is bad and that it is like incredibly harmful to and limits our opportunity to engage with new ideas, engage with new historical contexts, grow, understand as human, and doesn't create a society that is overall better because these ideas won't stop from being on circulation on your side of the house. Alrighty, grab those.
So, ready? Great. We're going to start off on side opposition with going over and clarifying the model a bit more before diving into the rebuttal and then our constructive case. So we think that we're referring to in this debate as a model more of just like institutions and the government in general, not specifically libraries, because I think you can still have the same debate talking about the active analysis and the point in the government without limiting yourself to libraries. And we still include libraries on our side for our motion. So then, starting off with some of the rebuttals that come from the points coming out there, we're not going to like dispute anything the benefit books bring to society and how books can move you. We're not saying that books are bad. But we're going to now talk about like some of your points. First, you say it limits free speech. You said that, oh, the government not having like books and libraries just limits free speech. Well, we think that one, the government does have the right to say what is and isn't included in their own libraries. We think that libraries have the ability to decide what they should and shouldn't put on themselves. And we think that this motion, them banning a book, is just the exact same thing as them not actively having it on their shelf. If the government decides not to put a book on the shelf of the library because there are infinite books and limited bookshelf space, it's the same thing as just like banning it. And we think that the government has the ability to ban books within its own institution. That's like clearly established. And then we're going to go into some of our points right now. And first we're going to start with the principle of justification about why the government has the ability to ban certain types of media. So the first is looking out for the welfare of its citizens. So we think that there are instances where the books can be detrimental to the well-being of its citizens, and the government has a responsibility to go in there. This can be whether a book is like particularly hateful toward one certain group, or actively pushes an incorrect agenda on another group, and that we're going to talk about uniquely why there are situations where people can't escape reading books that are detrimental to them, such as states pushing bad agendas on their citizens, such as books about creationism. And then ultimately, we think that the government has a unique responsibility and has taken the responsibility of educating people. And we think that what you show and what you don't show to students is part of that responsibility of educating them. So if the government says we are not going to use this book to educate our citizens, it's the same as the government saying like we are going to use this book to educate our citizens. And we think that like the government, as part of this education, needs to also protect people from information that is just completely false and would harm that education the government has taken the responsibility of providing. And then also, another principal point is that this can serve as a check against itself. The government can check itself using this power. Because if one wayward state decides to go around and push this radical agenda with its government and only stock its libraries with religious textbooks, or a local library wants to do that, the state can go to the library and say, hey, stop pushing these radical books that are harmful and start promoting these better books that are more accurate. We think that the government and the higher up government should have the ability to limit what is and isn't present on the shelves of a library or in the schools, because when you go into it, what we think is books, and here's going into our more materialistic points, books can be very harmful to those who are forced to read them. And you mentioned this point about it's never a situation where books are forced to or pushed upon you. You can just simply ignore them on the bookshelves. That is not always the case, because as we mentioned, in states such as Texas, you are forced to have creationism textbooks, and what they see is that they force upon these students books that specifically talk about there not being evolution and all that. And we think it is the responsibility of either the state government to go to certain local jurisdictions and say, hey, you're not allowed to use that book anymore because it's scientifically false and it's harming the education of citizens, or also the federal government to tell the states that you are not allowed to provide this factually incorrect information to your students, and you should not use those books in schools. And as we mentioned, it's its own institution. The government has the ability to ban that. Not right now. And then also going into this point, it says that ultimately the outcome of this is that if you allow all these places to just go and publish whatever they want, it leads to bad information and a bad uneducated populace filled with bigotry and factually incorrect information. And we think that with the government's ability in these very specific instances to ban the books that are scientifically false or aggressive and just hateful towards minorities and transgender students, we think that emerges a better populace. And what we think the government side has to do, the motion gives the government an obligation to accept that it should never be done. That they can't just come in here and push on us the worst possible use of book banning that ever exists. They have to accept on their side of the house that is always, in every single instance, unjustified. And as long as we push and prove that there is one instance where the government can and it is beneficial that they ban a book, our side of the house stands. And then ultimately, their whole point about Harry Potter is being banned in schools misses the meat of the debate. This isn't just about oh, Harry Potter's a good book and people aren't going to read it. It's when people, as in this instance, when state governments or local governments force just factually incorrect information upon students, when students are forced to read books that they don't want to, there should be a check that mitigates that and prevents people from being forced to read these books. And we think that comes in the form of another government banning that use of that book. So we think that, here, I'll take a POI now.
Okay, so you need to clarify why banning books ultimately creates a better populace when you can just get new ideas that are equally harmful from the internet or the media or just other people. Why would banning books get any of the effects that you get on your side of the house, given that books aren't even the most popular form of getting information?
Okay, so you're going to say, oh, there's always this other alternative, there's always the internet. Yes, there is the internet, but if you ban a book, it is also just going to be less circulated than it would be on the other side of the house. We think that bans on books can still be effective. Yes, you can always probably go into the black market and find anything, but it's going to be less widely circulated, and we think the less widely circulated something that's damaged is, ultimately the better off you are. And then also in certain situations, such as like with schools and with libraries, you don't have this other option of the internet. Students don't have the ability, if they're being taught creationism, to like in class go on the internet and find their own thing. When they have these books forced upon them, they don't have the ability to go out and do their own soul searching with information. We think that by doing this and giving this check, it really protects students who are forced to read this misinformation. So ultimately, what we prove on our side of the house is there is a principled justification to ban certain welfare, because banning these books can look out for the welfare and educate people, while also protecting people from harmful information. And we think that the government has an obligation to do this, and they need to prove that it's always unjust to do so. These reasons we are proud to oppose.
I don't like where you are. I'm gonna be honest, I don't really like this question.
I thought it was better when I wrote it, and then I realized it's not that good. Well, that's okay, because they're judging us as individuals. Okay.
So I would like to start with some points of rebuttal. So first, OO said that the government should be able to decide what they have, and not having a book is the same as banning a book. But we don't agree with that, because you can always request a book from an institution or a library, and the institution will go and buy the book in order for it to be there. And if you ban the book, then you can never get it. So the institution or the library not having the book is not the same as them banning the book, because you can always go and request the book for yourself. OO also said that having these books can help push radical ideas or push radical books, but that's not necessarily true, because the book isn't being pushed, it's just available for user consumption. It's just on the shelf. They're not pushing these radical ideas. It's just available for consumption. They also said how it's forcing factually incorrect books, but books are labeled as fiction or nonfiction, so you're not forcing incorrect information on anybody, because they are labeled and put into their specific genres. There's also like science fiction as well. They also said how some students can go off and look on the internet, but some students don't have internet access, which is why they would go to the library and get these books, and which is why these books are important for them to have within the library. OO also mentioned a lot about creationism and books about creationism, but there is a division between church and state and public schools, but that does not account to private schools, because they are their own institutions. So these private schools can have these books about creationism, so this pushing these books about creationism it would only apply to public schools, because of the division between church and state in these schools.
You said that some students don't have access to information on the internet. Doesn't that just prove our point how a ban would be effective, and also prove the point that they're limited by states, like whatever the state decides to give them, they're forced to read that?
No, if they don't have access to the internet, the only way for them to get information is at the library. Then banning these books is just limiting their information even more, because they don't have access to the internet and they don't have access to these other books that they could be reading. I would also like to extend on some of the points that we made about why books are good, why banning books is good, and even if you think it's beneficial in some cases, or why banning books is bad, and even if you think it's beneficial in some cases, why society isn't better when books are banned. And so we talked about how having these books can increase understanding of certain situations, but it also is a form of escape for some people, and reading books can be therapeutic. So having a larger variety of books for these people to read can help them. It could be like self-care for them. It could be therapeutic for them, and it could be a form of escape for them. Also, by banning books, like I said, you're limiting access to people who already can't get these books. And you guys brought up the idea of including institutions in the model. And if you include institutions in the model, there are students at institutions who can't afford books that they would need. So having these books in the library and not banning them from the institution's libraries can increase access for these students, because sometimes they can't buy the books on their own and they will go to this library or go to the institution to get these libraries. And this helps to support like low-income individuals who want to read. By having all these books there for them to read, they'll have like a greater variety that they can choose from. We also wanted to talk about why banning books is bad, and so we wanted to focus on like where does censorship stop. So we talked about how they banned Harry Potter because like Christians would like ban Harry Potter because of the witchcraft, but then that banning books would end up being like arbitrary to what each institution or library thinks is good or bad, and so it's not necessarily, oh, this is actually good or this is actually bad. It's just going to be arbitrary to what each individual thinks, and so banning books in that sense is like incorrect. And also we wanted to talk about why, even if you think it's beneficial, why banning books is bad. And so since you guys brought up the idea of as an institution, students who can't afford to go out and buy the book would go, even if it was banned from the institution, they would go and find the book any other way. So why ban it at all? And inadvertently it'll affect the poor. Inadvertently affects the poor who can't afford these books, and so having them on the shelves can help them go and get these books out.
So you say that students are just going to go find it another place, but then you also said that students don't have access and they're uniquely dependent on the library. So they're dependent on the library, or can they just go look wherever they want?
So it's usually if they don't have access to the internet, that they would be lower income, most likely, and they'll go to the library to find these books. But we were saying how people who are wealthier would be the ones who can't afford the books, and even if they couldn't afford the book, they would go online and buy the book off of Amazon, or they would go online, even if the school didn't have the book, they would go online and buy the book off of Amazon because they can't afford the book. We also wanted to point out that having these books increases awareness around certain issues. So I know books are banned because of like sexual assault, racial issues, or like different political views, but having these books can help, and there's like these triggers in these books, but having these books can help to increase awareness around these certain issues, such as sexual assault or racial issues and political views, and there can be discussions held on these books that other people can have in order to raise awareness on these issues. We also wanted to talk about how some people may also ban books due to sensitivity, and we can also talk about how some people ban books due to sensitivity, but having these books increases awareness around these issues, and it's important to discuss these issues. So like we said before, banning books are good and beneficial to the people, and banning them limits access. It limits free speech of authors who can't share their ideas, and censoring these books is also arbitrary, and also having these books in the library is good because it helps the people who actually can't afford to buy these books on their own. And for that reason, we're proud to propose.
Everyone good? Opening government has not met the burden given to them by the motion. The motion requires that they do one of three things. Either one, they must principally demonstrate that the act of banning books is itself unjust in every instance, irrespective of the material consequences of that banning. Two, they must principally prove that on aggregate, a world in which the precedent of book banning is set is a world that is principally unjust because there is net more harm done than good done by book banning. Or three, they must win the material debate by proving that there is no conceivably good instance of book banning. I don't think they've argued any of these points particularly well, and so we'll engage with all of them in our constructive points, proving why they do not meet their burden at any of these levels, and why it is significantly better why to, in some instances, accept that there are obligations that exist to ban books. First, a few points of rebuttal. I think they've debated themselves into a corner here with the libraries example, because if we are to, for some reason, go along with their framing and their arguments that they are only talking about books being distributed passively rather than actively, then I'm not clear that, actionably speaking, there can be a clearly defined moral distinction between a policy banning a book and a library simply not putting a book on its shelf, between an institution simply not circulating a book. I don't understand what the meaningful distinction is here. I think the only place in which there is an actionable distinction is when we are talking about things like books in the curricula that are actually going to be distributed to people, which answers their arguments about books not being pushed onto the people, because most of the time book bans relate not just to it is illegal for this book to exist, it is illegal to own a copy of its book in almost any historical instance. Rather, what book bans almost look like are circulation level bans, which operate at the level of things like publishers, school districts, etc., and their ability to spread the books, right? Which means I think I think their examples are pretty weak in the context of this debate, and even if you do take them at face value, are not particularly persuasive. I also think it's dangerous to argue that passive exposure alone justifies putting any material into a library, because the logical conclusion of that argument is that libraries should be obligated to work on some first come, first served, or random basis, rather than have some measure of discrimination as when determining what constitutes appropriate material. I think, given that they have not engaged with any of our principled argumentation about the government having an obligation to maintain citizen welfare and an obligation to maintain a stronger citizenry, because that is where it derives its legitimacy from, I think the libraries obviously have an obligation to maintain some discriminatory standards. So I don't think any of their arguments stand super strong here. Finally, they make a slippery slope argument that the government has no moral authority. I think the arguments about citizen welfare and needing to maintain an educated populace, as well as preventing the circulation of material that has a causal link into things like bigotry, is already a pretty strong obligation level argument here. But even if you don't buy that the government has moral authority to do this in a vacuum, I think we've already won this argument on the basis of the fact that whether, on both sides of the house, you live in a world where the government, whether you think it is right or not, has given itself the moral authority to control what books are distributed. Given that there are different actors within a government, that is to say governments are federalized, governments have different parties, etc., etc., it is the obligation of one part of a government, when they recognize an injustice is being done by the distribution of a certain branch, by a certain aspect of their federation, they have a moral obligation to step in. The moral landscape has changed in this instance, right? Ultimately, what we're looking at is a world in which there's no slippery slope argument, right? This sort of book banning is not the moral bright line for whether states are authoritarian or not. You can argue a world where the United States blanket has every library, every school, public and private, every government institution say, we will never ban books. And that does not suddenly make the government less authoritarian. It does not suddenly mean that the government does not constantly infringe on, for example, Fourth Amendment rights by engaging in passive surveillance, right? Or in developing nations where the impacts to book banning are more likely to be felt. The ability to ban media or not is almost never going to be the difference maker, especially if their arguments about the internet are true, as to whether revolutionary material is spread, nor is it going to be the difference maker in determining whether or not those people have freedom, right? The government does not get some brand new moral authority from saying we haven't banned books, therefore we have moral authority. On our constructive points in the debate, I think I've engaged with the majority of the principal debate here. The fact that the government has an obligation to check itself, actually I've already dealt with that. Ultimately, the largest problem here, Ultimately, the largest problem with the way they have handled the principal debate is that they have not engaged in a reason why book banning in a vacuum is good. They've given you generic reasons why books are good in some instances. We have told you there are plenty more instances where books are likely to be bad, right? There are going to be books such as, for example, the textbooks published in Texas that refer to slavery as voluntary, or in certain school districts advocate for creationism as being a good thing. I'm going to engage in the aggregate world here, right? In case you don't buy a KG, we can prove one instance where book banning is good. I'm going to engage with an aggregate world here where we look like what a world looks like where a precedent of book banning is set, right? They're going to argue that on balance this leads to more bad than good. I've already given you a reason why this probably isn't a very big impact, because this is almost never the tipping point for authoritarianism, and their slippery slope argument is almost never the case. But even if you were to buy that it is, I think on aggregate you are going to get better results on our side of the house, because on both sides of the house there are pernicious local actors engaging in the willful distribution of texts that sometimes have bad information. We think that because larger scale governments, like national governments, are almost always going to have the final say in these disputes, and because we think that national governments are, even in corrupt, even in far-right countries, almost always less amenable to corruption and less amenable to polarization, especially to the far right, than local governments, just due to things like law of large numbers and having to engage in the global economy and global politics, means that on aggregate you are almost always going to see that this right you're almost always going to see that these decisions are being made to allow books that have more information, books that are closer to the truth on aggregate, even if there are certain instances where it's bad. Yes.
Your argument is grounded on this government that has this really high moral that abides by moral reasoning, but in Nazi Germany when they banned books that related to liberal democracy, you took away people's ability
I think I've already
protest the government.
I think I've already made it abundantly clear why Nazi Germany wouldn't have been stopped if they had just refused to pursue a book burning policy, and why that probably wouldn't have made a difference. Even if you think that it would have, the moral threshold doesn't have to be high, right? We're not going to defend that the Trump administration is going to make the right decision in 100% of these cases, but we'll make the argument that on aggregate, a national government such as the U.S. national government will make better decisions than the local governments, which are giving themselves the right to distribute harmful materials, a right that exists on either side of the House. Therefore, their side of the House is depriving any possible check on that. The impacts of this are huge, right? When you have students growing up thinking that slavery was voluntary or that creationism is true, what you get is an uneducated populace who is more likely to be bigoted, is more likely to engage in hate crimes that make the world a more uncomfortable place for a huge number of people they interact with day in, day out. The only way to address this is if the government takes a stand and recognizes that due to the pernicious influences that exist in parts of it, it has an obligation to, at least in some instances, use bans as a mechanism to create better material results. This proves that we win on both the principle debate and, more importantly, they haven't met their burden on any principled argument, and that there are material benefits to some instances of banning books, even if you force us to defend the aggregate world of book banning as a whole. Proud to oppose.
Honorable panel, it seems like there is a mismatch between side opposition and side government of who and why are they going to ban the book if ever there is going to be a ban for the book. But then first I'm going to address the two cases. First, in the cases of why libraries would never ban books and why government also would and should never ban books. But then first of all, we want to talk about how it is a matter of principle, a matter of freedom for citizens to choose what they want to read, when they want to read, and how they want to read it. When we give the government the autonomy and authority to choose why and how people should read this specific stuff, we impede in their freedom of expression, in their freedom to think what they should believe, and we give them in general less credit. We feel like people, many citizens or many Americans are so not smart that someone saying that the earth is flat or those stuff, they would agree with them instead of actual very backed up scientific evidence that's proved time and time again that those things do not exist. But then I will show about in all cases why banning books is not beneficial from anyone. First, in the cases of libraries should never ban books because libraries are supposed to be a place of education where people are supposed to be educated, where they are supposed to see where and how thoughts are being formed and the arguments for these thoughts of these facts. And then so because of this reason, and also side government addresses it by the second speaker about how many people, some students wouldn't have access to books, and because they are in poverty, libraries should be those places where they should be able to get any books they would want to. But also it supports creativity, it supports people learning and people having the ability to form their dreams and then see if they want to go into fiction or write romance or see, for example, a biography of Bill Gates and be like, I don't know, amazed by it and then say they want to do something better for the society. But most importantly, it's about discussion. When we put every book together, even the books that we believe, this is bullshit, it doesn't have anything to do. We need to be able to bring those books to the table and show why this is bullshit. Because while banning them, as side government also already said, people can access them through the internet. People can access them one way or another. They will see those books like, why was these books banned? Why in this reason we assume this is bad? I don't think being said this is just bad isn't enough of a good reason to ban books in general. Yes, I will take your question, then go to my construction.
Sure. If I publish if I self-publish my racist manifesto, send it to the local library, they decline it, and send an email telling every other library that they should not respond to my emails, has an injustice been done?
At least we're giving the freedom to those libraries to choose what books they want to put on their shelves or not. In this case, the government is not giving the freedom to those people. And if you publish your racist manifesto, you still have the right. You still have the right to publish it if someone wants to publish. You can also publish it independently. You can create your own library with your other racist friends. So it's not really impossible for you to have those books in the society. But then let's talk about side opposition. Talk about it's only in the term of curricula that the government is going to ban books. That's absolutely not true. Modern Germany till 2017, Mein Kampf was banned in modern Germany until 2017. In these cases, and many books are banned from China in this type of cases. Talking about only curricula is absolutely false and mismanaged, and is actually showing the people how uninformed side opposition is about banning books in the rest of the world. But now let's talk about why government should never ban books. Government should never ban books because when we give government that much authority, they can choose what books they want, and then they can choose to ban authors who criticize them. They can choose to ban people who they think as a threat to their authority, as a threat to their power, and as a threat to people to form their own opinions and see what is actually not working in the government. When they ban this position, in all instances, banning book is not good, because once we give that freedom to the government, even if a good government, let's say the Obama administration, wouldn't ban any books. Trump may ban books, and Trump may ban books if we give him the freedom to do so when he sees that he's being criticized. So in all instances, when we give this layout, it's going to spread to all other places. But let's talk about, secondly, how side opposition start talking about creationism. I just want to point out that, first of all, many religious texts are founded in creationism. They think that the earth was created by God, by I have power. But then, which lead me to my argument that I want to make about banning religious books. Many people, the religion is the founder and the pillar of their lives. It's what takes them out of the bed every single morning. It's that they see the whole purpose of their life is to be religious, to live by what God said, and to live by these morals. And many religion and religious institutions have done good in the past and are still doing good. They are guiding billions of people around the world. And those books are the central fundamental pillar of those religions. Those are the texts they go by. Those are the guidelines of their lifestyles. And then when we decide a government who doesn't believe in creationism and said, oh, religious texts are being creationism, so we should ban those books, that will take closing.
Thank you. Yeah, so these kids can learn about creationism in their churches or their synagogues or whatever, but for example, the public education sphere is not the place to learn about it.
The public, as I already pointed out, if we give the government the freedom to ban books, they wouldn't only ban it in public authorization. In the status quo right now, the government choose what goes in the public education and what shouldn't go in the public. It doesn't mean those books are being banned. But when we take a step further and say we would ban books, government can ban books in churches, government can ban books in all the territory around the world. That is happening right now in China, and that happened in Germany until 2017, where people couldn't see the point of view of Hitler, where he was coming from, and why the Holocaust, the hell, happened in the first place. So when we give the layout to those governments, they will ban those books in churches, which is the central government and the central purpose of many religious people would be banned, crushed, and they wouldn't even have the authority to say, hey, I believe in that, and these are my books, my guidelines, this is why I'm doing this is why I'm giving to charity, this is why I'm praying this morning or meditating. We wouldn't have all these guidelines for those people who believe. Billions of people would be lost. Billions of people wouldn't have their lifestyle guidelines that are being guiding them every single day. But it's, in summary, when we talk about banning books, let's remember, we ban books in all the territory, not only churches or not only school or libraries or school, but we ban them in places everywhere you can find them, like it's happening in Germany and China. And the government can use that to ban people who are who are opposing them or who are opposing their policies. And it's also banning people, religious people, from their pillars and what guide them every single day to wake up in the morning. And for all of these reasons, we're incredibly proud to propose.
Honorable panel, I would first like to begin my speech by talking about our unique extension coming out of closing opposition with integrated rebuttal throughout and then with extraneous rebuttal afterwards. So the extension that closing opposition brings to the table is that banning books and selective censorship can prevent re-indoctrination in individuals, right? So OO very briefly kind of skimmed the surface on this, and we're going to actually do some real in-depth work with this kind of idea. So getting into the idea of indoctrination, right? There's a lot of books out there that have a lot of hateful messages in them and really nasty opinions towards minority groups of people, as seen with like slavery and racism towards African Americans, and poor treatment of the Jews around the time of the Holocaust. And so what you see is that individuals who are able to read these books in spheres such as like school districts or in libraries have the potential to be re-indoctrinated by the messages provided throughout by these hateful authors. So if extremely hateful rhetoric and philosophy is used in these books, and an individual who might be susceptible to this rhetoric and philosophy reads the book, then they get turned into another agent, harmful agent against society and against minority groups, right? And so these processes are kind of allowed for the individuals to read the language and believe these bigoted ideas. Clear examples of this is that if an individual is kind of susceptible to believing ideas of like neo-Nazism and they read Mein Kampf, maybe they're a poor individual who feels like nothing in the world is going right and they're looking for someone to blame for it. Then they read Mein Kampf and they read the rhetoric that Hitler writes about, and they kind of read it and strongly agree with it and start to begin to agree with it as well, and then boom, that's another person that's a neo-Nazi and is harmful to society and is racist and anti-Semitic and generally can commit such acts such as hate crimes. Yes.
Sure, that person is a neo-Nazi. Cool. We can arrest them if that person commits a crime, as long as the person is not committing a crime. What's the point of banning the book? Because that person is going to have that idea.
Okay, first of all, it's a bad precedent to set that, we're gonna allow for people to actively become more and more hateful and just wait until they commit a crime and then arrest them. And secondly, along with that, there are extreme harms coming from society just becoming more and more hateful and bigoted as a whole, in terms of less understanding of others, more rage and kind of just anger in the world, and less peace and harmony in general. Therefore, this society kind of suffers and the world is at a lower point. Also, arguments brought up a lot by opposition talked about how it's important for everybody for people to understand what these individuals are talking about. Yeah, sure, fine. You can read about that in a textbook, which summarizes that the arguments that were made, or summarizes what that text significance was, right? Like, so in a textbook you can read like, Hitler was anti-Semitic and he wrote a book, Mein Kampf, where he talked about basically his hatred for Jews, right? You don't actually have to. You can have that available rather than individuals actually reading the rhetoric and language used in the hundreds of pages written by Hitler that could actually convince someone and indoctrinate them to believe those views as well. This kind of goes into like some of the arguments brought up by opposition, so like closing out, or by government. So closing government brought up like the example of how Mein Kampf was banned in Germany. Good, that's perfect, because they talk about how students couldn't understand why Hitler would cause the Holocaust. You can find that in any textbook about how he went to art school, failed out, found someone to blame, and it was the Jewish people, and then then had the hateful ideology, and you can get a summary of that rather than actually reading the novel itself, right? So in these textbooks, so we'd rather have bans used, have bans available from the government in case of these books that have very hurtful language and rhetoric that have the ability to indoctrinate. Now to get into some extraneous rebuttal. So closing government talks heavily about how the freedom for people to choose what they can read and what they want to read. There's no society where anybody can do anything they want. There are restrictions on freedom of speech in the U.S., one of the most liberal places in the world. And if there's going to be freedom of speech in terms of if there's speech that can endanger people. And so the idea that there should be just freedom to do what you want isn't necessarily a good argument precedent to use, because that's not always the case. Secondly, they bring up the idea that people are smart enough to not believe these bad scientific ideas and theories, but the fact of the matter is that people do. People do believe in the flat Earth theory and no, not this moment, and deny climate change and believe in arguments and other theories that aren't true. And the member of government also talks about they're in their extension about ban on religious books and how it's important not to have any religious books banned, and even brought up the idea of a creationism textbook and how that could be important for individuals of a religious belief who agree with that. We'd like to draw attention. No, not this moment. We'd like to draw attention to the historical precedent of religion being used to actively promote racism and slavery in the past through different texts and different books, and how a ban on these would be that's actually kind of exactly completely flows into our whole extension about how there could be reindoctrination, because if people read, I'm in protected time. So if people read these books that talk about, that use religion as a justification to explain why African Americans are inferior to whites, then people can be reindoctrinated into those beliefs, and then you have another hateful person in society. So on our side of the house, what you see is the ability for hateful texts and reindoctrination to be stemmed and to be much lessened, and you have a society that's much less hateful, has much less bigotry, as a result will probably have much less crime and conflict in it. And on the other side of the house, all they have is the idea that people should be able to kind of to read, to foster creativity in libraries and have the freedom to read what they want, but they kind of can neglect a lot of the harms that come with certain books in society. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
So I'm presenting the government whip speech along with some rebuttals throughout. So on the opening, we still see this huge clash within the model. We take opening, a government would say we say that as a library we would ban books. But they really haven't shown us why it's in the best interest of the library. So we take that, which wasn't really clarified until Hajar mentioned this. So we take this modeling at their best, and so we do ban in terms of. In the instances that we are the actors of libraries, we think that it's important to clarify the best interest of the library to really weigh the situation. So this wasn't done until Hajar really weighed the purpose and the interest of the library, which is really hugely important in the validation of what open government is saying. And we agree with opposition that we're not that there are benefits to books. They're not really disqualifying the benefits to books, but we think that think that it's dangerous, mentioned by Hajar, that we give the government so much authority in terms of choosing what's right and wrong, especially when governments, let's say in the U.S., they have very clear agendas such as promoting a democratic value. So when there's a very clear agenda, we think it's dangerous to promote ideas that are so in line with a specific agenda. Because when you do that and you promote anything with outside, we think that it leads to a more closed-minded society overall and the inability to connect with anyone that doesn't have the same agenda as you. So for example, in the U.S., with a very clear capitalism society, you ban ideas that like that's very opposite, like communism, that doesn't allow your agenda. So what happens is that you allow inability to connect with people, like let's say in China, and understand why they would even want to consider that. Because what happens now, like mentioned by Hajar, you ostracize completely not only we also ostracize also the idea. So it's important to consider on our side not only the readers in this case, but also the actual publishers. This is like what we should prioritize on the side of government, in the sense that when you when you ban these ideas, the connotation here is that what happens here is that you actually further ostracize not only the idea but the people who believe in these ideas. So what happens here, you actually further lead to separation in terms of people who do believe in the idea. Who believe in ideas, but what happens to them is that they're probably get mad that institutionally our ideas are now like illegal or banned, and they're gonna, because they're mad, because now they are mad, they're less likely to listen to the other side, and when you're less likely to listen, you're gonna they won't really realize like what their ideas might have been wrong. They've just been like so infuriated with like anger and like a refusal to listen. I'll take over.
Sure. It's already incredibly difficult to reason extremists out of positions they didn't reason themselves into. How is it at least not marginally better if in some instances they can't get access to material that can foment their ideas and distribute it?
Okay, so in that sense, we think that you won't really, we agree that there's like bipartisan extremists and that will exist. So in terms of the government, we don't think you're actually going to get the consensus on banning what is right and what is wrong, and was like a consensus of what is right and what is wrong, especially with seeing the bipartisan in the government. And we just think that it's better on our side when we allow these ideas to still exist, and we teach them, we show what it is, and then we more elaborately show why it's wrong, than to just to ban them completely and not give people a chance to even read them and to understand why it's wrong. We think there's more logic on their side, and we lead to more understanding logically why these things are wrong than just blindly banning them. Because what happens is that you just give too much authority to the government, and you let people you assume that the government will always know what is best. Will always know what is best. Right. So I'll just clarify what exactly has Hajjar contributed to this round, which shows you why it's more important to emphasize on choice and how this will really interfere with the freedom of expression within these people, and what this really underlies the democratic values of society, democratic values of our society, and we show you why, in terms of religious books, it's important to we have them available in terms of guiding people, even if their ideas don't align with a scientific agenda. It's important to have them available. And when you ban these books, what happens to the people who follow these religions? They become very further ostracized from society, and people who don't follow them are going to say, "Oh, why do you follow a religion that the government has institutionally banned?" They lead to these misconceptions and these preconceptions of these people. So what happens here is that you inhibit people to really further reach over the aisle and to understand. I'll take closing.
Oh, never mind.
Okay. Right. So what happens here? You not only ostracize the authors, but also the people who follow the ideas. So okay. And in terms of as a rebuttal to what mentioned about racism, we think that more practically speaking, more practically speaking, is that racism comes from the inability, not having enough exposure, but not necessarily reading books of why, let's say, these minority groups are bad. Most likely the people who are who haven't been exposed to any who are more uneducated, and people who are just exposed to a very homogenous group of ideas. And then with their case, by banning books, you're going to be leading to a more homogenous group of ideas. And we think that that's dangerous. We think that by practically banning books, you're not actually going to be seeing the results that they're going to be wishing for in terms of less racism, like mentioned by closing.
Okay, you talk about how it's hard for the government to determine what's right and wrong. Isn't it fairly obvious that ideas such as racism and anti-Semitism are clearly wrong in society?
Okay, we're not going to agree that those aren't wrong ideas, but we think that but to give the government so much authority and to always just ban them, I think it's better for the people to read them and to understand more logically why they're wrong than to blindly have the government enforce and their ideas of what is wrong on the people. And because there's so much bipartisan in the government, we don't think you're actually going to be getting the consensus of what is right and wrong in the case of other instances. So we think that on side of opposition, they haven't really uniquely shown us why this model will give them the effects and like the impacts they want by uniquely banning books, because books you're going to be getting these information otherwise as well. So we think that their argument overall doesn't lay that intact in terms of the results are not unique to their situation. With that, we are super proud to propose.
Honorable panel, 2 questions in this debate. First, who best prevents future societal harm, aka best or provides best societal benefit? And second being, who accesses the best version that books have to offer, like the best version of knowledge? The answer to both of these questions is going to be bench, but more specifically closing opposition. But before I get into that, I'm going to do some extraneous rebuttal from what we just heard from closing government. So the first thing we hear from closing government is that they're worried about the government abusing its authority. But first of all, 3 responses to this. First, if they are living in, for example, a democratic nation or a Western liberal democracy, then if citizens are upset with their government, they can vote them out of office, etc., through democratic means. If the citizens are not living in a democratic government, there are always other options to protest against the government through protests, rebellions, etc., to voice that they're upset with their government's decisions, and in these places as well. Thirdly, in both of these places, there exists the media and newspapers, etc., which are not banned and can spread, and the citizens can talk about their government in that way. And so in those ways, the government is still checked. It's checked by its citizens, it's checked by the media, etc. And so we don't think that this picture that they give you that the government is going to abuse its authority is actually very realistic and can actually be mitigated very well. Okay, so then they tell you that they're worried about the citizens understanding, the citizens getting the logic of where these people are coming from. But as Justin clearly told you, citizens can access this logic, can access this quote-unquote understanding through non-biased, impartial, for example, textbooks in schools or things like that. They can read in a textbook about what Hitler did and what Hitler thought, rather than reading Mein Kampf, which is filled with hatred, filled with rhetoric that is filled with hatred and bigotry, and that actually puts them at risk for actual indoctrination of these ideas, precisely because it's filled with that rhetoric rather than just historical account, which we think is 2 very different versions of a story. And we think that as side opposition, we want the story that's coming from a more historical account perspective, rather than from the actual person themselves who is actually spreading this hateful rhetoric through their writing, right? We don't want that. Thirdly, they're worried about ostracizing those citizens who believe these views. We say fine. We say we think actually in the long run it's probably a good thing that these views or these people that are writing these things are ostracized, because we think at the end of the day what happens is that a society shuns that view and they say we don't accept that view. In our society, the view eventually dies down. We think it'll go away. We think it'll die out. And that's what we want. We don't want white nationalism in the United States. We want those protesters in Charlottesville to go away. And we think that by actively ostracizing them or banning material written by them, for example, we think that actually shows that's the government actively sending a message that we don't allow for these types of hatred, for this hatred and bigotry within our society, which we think in the long run is a lot better and creates a better society that's actually absent of this hatred. Okay, so moving on to the 2 questions of today. So who best prevents actual societal harm that might come out of coming out of government? Because we think that coming out of government is this really scary idea where citizens have access to all of these different ideologies, which we're not saying that having access to different ideologies is bad. What we're saying is that having access to the actual rhetoric of it is really dangerous, and that's the main extension that you got coming out from Justin, right? We told you about how this rhetoric can actually lead to re-indoctrination of these historical perspectives, such as these horrible anti-Semitic things that were coming out of Nazi Germany, specifically
even from Mein Kampf, rather than reading it in a textbook, for example. And so we think that precisely because the rhetoric itself is so dangerous, we think that on our side of the house, specifically through closing opposition, we're actually able to actively work to prevent this type of radicalization that can come from this rhetoric, the type of like dehumanization that can come from this rhetoric, right? Because that's what this rhetoric actively does. It radicalizes people, it actively dehumanizes people, and there's a way to learn about what Hitler did or what different genocidal regimes did without actually reading the text that justifies their point of view, right? Because that's what the rhetoric does. It justifies their point of view. We don't want our citizens reading things that, no thank you, right now. That we don't want citizens reading like what justifies that person's point of view. We just want them to read what did they think, what did they do, and like why was this horrible, right? That's what we want them to know, not like how it's justified. Moving on into the second question, so who actually accesses like the best version of what these books have to offer? Because like we said, we agree with opening government that like the purpose of books is to like spread knowledge and is about different perspectives, but we think that the perspective that you get on their side of the house that radicalizes and dehumanizes is actually really dangerous, right? What we want on our side of the house, what we get specifically from closing opposition is the active prevention of this, and what we get is the actual I'll take Quinn in 1 second. So what we get is the actual like propagation of books that talk about these types of views without like justifying them through their rhetoric, right? Because we want to avoid that radicalization and justification. But Quinn, before I move on to Wayne.
So it's not just harmful books that could be banned. In Trump's America, it could be books on climate change. Relying on government morality is dangerous, especially in the Trump administration. But in China, where books are banned, the media is censored, curriculum is limited, and the internet does not have any view on the harmful things China is doing.
Thank you. I understand your point. I understand your point. Thank you. It's been 15 seconds. Okay, so I think OO handled this pretty well when they already answered that similar question by saying that, like, for example, especially within the United States, like, Trump's only going to be president for a certain period of time, and we think that in the long run, especially in Western liberal democracies, these types of bans are going to be effective, and they're actually going to be for the good of society rather than for the harm, right? So we think, So moving on into Wayne. So why does closing opposition take it over the government bench? First of all, specifically for opening government, we think that they access a really, really low impact in this debate, right? They want to talk about libraries. Who the hell even goes to libraries anymore, right? We think that's like a very low impact in the debate, so we don't think that people are actually even going to engage with the perspectives that opening government actually wants them to engage with, and we think that the fact that the books are even on the shelves in the library in the first place is a danger of reindoctrination, like we told you, and we think that the danger of reindoctrination is a much greater impact than what OG has to give you, as well as what OO has to give you. Even though they brought up good points, we think that CO's impact of reindoctrination of this historical thought is actually more dangerous and is going to be more harmful for society, and that's why you have to look to CO to access the more important impacts in this round. And finally, we take it over CG because Justin very readily defeated the religious extension by explaining that these types of religious views that they want have historically promoted racism, which is bad, and we don't want that. So for all these reasons, we are proud to oppose it.
Okay.
God, that was so long.
Whoever.
Hey, good debate, people.